Well, good morning, everybody, and it's great to be here. Thank you very much for asking me to come and speak, Ted. And look, I don't mind talking and answering questions on Brexit, but it's quite nice to actually do something focusing on something else. One of the problems with this damn Brexit issue is it just takes up the bandwidth of the whole of politics, government, Westminster. It doesn't really leave much space to discuss anything else, and I think the issue that you are talking about throughout the whole of today is an absolutely crucial issue for our country. And what I wanted to do was just tell you a bit about the work of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Social Integration, a bit of a mouthful, which I chair. And actually, I think we have some of my colleagues over there at the back from the Challenge who provide our secretariat, and for those who don't know, the Challenge is a leading charity that runs programs across the country to build a more socially integrated Britain, and we simply would not be able to do the work that we do on the APPG without their support, which I wanted to just mention. Now, the APPG itself was launched, it's a cross-party group of MPs in March 2016, and that was kind of 3 years ago now, and certainly in political terms it seems like a completely different era of calm, stability, compared to the chaos that we have now. And the impetus behind us establishing the APPG was a real and growing concern about the ways in which our society appears to be fragmenting along various different lines, and the damaging effect that this is having on us all, and I think will do in the future. And what is happening, this isn't just some kind of vague, amorphous thing. This is very real, and there is a significant body of evidence that shows that too often in Britain today you have people from different cultural, socio-economic and age groups and ethnic groups living side by side, and we revel in the diversity of Britain compared to other European countries, but the fact is a lot of these different groups are not mixing with one another, they aren't living interconnected lives, and we're becoming increasingly segregated. 3 years on, concerns about social division have only risen, and in many ways the question of social integration, or the lack of it, sits at the heart of so many of the most prominent social, political, economic debates of our time. And I think certainly up until now it's often gone unnoticed. I remember when we launched the APPG and Ted worked with us, and just talking about this very notion of us being increasingly segregated. There were people who were challenging what Ted and I were saying at the time of the launch, disputing that actually we are becoming more divided, and it was kind of unnoticed then. But I do think that the debate is changing in the light of Brexit. Just on Monday, the Prime Minister and I had an exchange about social cohesion in the House of Commons following her statement on what she's going to do in terms of next steps in this EU debate. And obviously she raises the issue in the context of potentially having another referendum on the European Union, but it's a bigger issue than that. And actually in the meeting that I had with her de facto deputy as part of the cross-party talks to try and find a way forward on Brexit in the Cabinet Office on Monday, this was an issue that came up as well. Now, our first inquiry looked at the integration of immigrants, and our report called for a much more proactive approach to the integration of new immigrants and much clearer routes to citizenship and English language provision. And we're going to be looking at the forthcoming immigration bill, which was actually, we were supposed to have the second reading of that the other week, which was cancelled because of Brexit. But we're going to look at that bill and see to what extent the principles in our report are included, or the extent to which we can amend that bill to embed those principles in the law. Our second and current inquiry has picked up on and is focusing on the question of intergenerational connection. And this is a question that hasn't always received so much attention, certainly not as much attention as the debate around ethnicity and immigration, but the voting patterns we saw in the 2016 referendum and the 2017 general election brought into very sharp relief the extent of the political divides that have opened up between young and old in our country. The Ipsos Social Research Institute has said that the 2017 general election saw the greatest political division between age groups they've ever witnessed. And furthermore, the polling that was published on behalf of the APPG by the Challenge and YouGov in December 2017 suggested, just reflect on this, that more than 1 in 4 Leave voters of retirement age believed lower wages for the next generation was a price worth paying for exiting the EU. While 1 in 4 Remain voters aged 18 to 24 would have accepted pension reductions for older people if that meant that Brexit was stopped. So you've got grandchildren wanting to screw their grandparents and grandparents wanting to screw their grandchildren. Now, we laugh, but it's pretty dispiriting. That is pretty dispiriting. And I think it just goes to show that this is something that we cannot afford to shy away from, because disagreement over Brexit has actually served to shine a light on the issue of generational division in this country, which was there anyway. Brexit wasn't the cause of that division, and that's something I think the Prime Minister really needs to reflect on. If she's worrying about another referendum, for example, opening up more division, that division is there. It is there. Brexit's just illustrating it. And in some ways, I think what has been most shocking for us through the course of the inquiry that we're doing at the moment has been the evidence of the extent to which physically, never mind what we think and our political views, but physically we are living separate lives. So take these statistics, for example. For the typical child in our largest cities, just 5% of people in their immediate neighbourhood are over the age of 65. Now in 1991, that was 15%. During the 24 years between 1991 and 2014, the median age of rural areas rose nearly twice as quickly as the median age of urban areas. And between 1981 and 2011, 3/4 of the increase in 45 to 65-year-olds and over 65-year-olds across the country took place in villages, communities, small and medium-sized towns, and by contrast, 80% of the growth in 25 to 44-year-olds occurred in large towns and core cities. So you see how physically we are becoming more separate. So it's not just that the different generations have appeared to have become increasingly polarized in their outlooks, but there appears to have been this increasing tendency for them to live quite separate lives with little regular interaction with one another. And one of the things that we were kind of struck by through the course of all the visits that we've been doing as part of this inquiry is that when you actually ask people, often people don't have much contact, for example, with their grandparents. But when you take the grandparents out of the picture, say, do you have any contact with people of that generation aside from your grandparents? Very little at all. So clearly we've got a decision to make. Do we simply accept these divisions as a regrettable fact of modern life? Or do we attempt to do something about them? I believe that not only must we attempt to do something about these divisions, we've got to tackle these divisions, but we cannot afford not to. We can't afford not to do something about this. And in seeking to find solutions, we're not starting from scratch. This is not rocket science. Our inquiry has heard evidence from and paid visits to a whole range of organisations who are attempting to build bridges between the generations within their communities. From organisations like the Cares Family, who we visited in Manchester, who create community networks of young professionals and older neighbours to come together, to socialise, to support one another. There was Apple and Honey Nightingale, which is an old people's home, which we visited in South London, which in 2017 opened the first nursery to be based at a care home in the UK. Incredibly inspiring stuff there. And we've seen numerous examples of pioneers like this who are pointing the way to a better, more integrated future. You can read all about them when we launch the interim report in the coming weeks, and I'll come back to that. But all of these organisations, they can't do what they do without much greater support than they are getting at the moment. And the principles they've been putting into practice deserve to be taken up much more widely across the country. So our upcoming interim report is going to set out the foundations of a policy framework we believe might help to achieve these things. Now, we'd had hoped to launch the report today, but that's been knocked sideways by the ongoing Brexit drama in Westminster. But I want to give you a special sneak preview of what some of these recommendations are going to look like. Now, first up, local government is hamstrung by a lack of resources at the moment, but notwithstanding the financial constraints, it could play a vital role simply by viewing its policies and implementing its programmes through a more intergenerational lens than local authorities currently do. Secondly, in our public services and, say, nursery and care provision, the principle of co-location of facilities for different age groups should become a watchword. It should be the norm. Thirdly, we've got to be explicit, particularly in our housing and planning policies, about the need to nurture intergenerational connection and look to foster public and private spaces in which all generations mix. And lastly, we've got to look more closely at what role technology and digital technologies in particular can play in building intergenerational connections rather than becoming spheres of increasing segmentation and division, never mind all the abuse, the shouting and the rest of it that you sometimes see, particularly in political debates. So these are some of the areas and the types of recommendations we're going to be putting forward. However, if we're going to make a serious attempt to build and improve intergenerational connections, we've got to be clear that there are going to be some difficult decisions to make. And those decisions are going to pose challenges to those of different political viewpoints. If we agree that increasing dislocation between generations is something we need to address, then obviously a laissez-faire approach is certainly not going to suffice. The right balance is going to have to be struck between carrots and sticks in terms of what central government does, and it's undoubtedly going to have to take a lead in all of this. To give one example, fostering greater intergenerational connections through hospitals and care homes is only going to happen in a systematic way if it is driven and it's gripped by the Department for Health and Social Care. But on the other hand, intergenerational connections are not, you cannot form those by governments. They're formed in local communities, through the third sector, through clubs, through activities, local services, in neighbourhoods designed for all ages and appropriate to those communities. And as such, communities are normally, I think, going to be best placed to know what might work for them, for their area, and to develop their own initiatives. And so we should enable local councils and others and empower them to do this stuff. At the same time, we must recognise that supporting and enabling these initiatives will be difficult without any extra money to do so. And we've seen in the course of our inquiry that the closure of shared spaces like community centres and libraries and the reduction in local transport services, things that have clearly come as a result of the austerity of recent years, have served to reduce opportunities for different generations to connect. But I think we've got to be aware of thinking that ending austerity is a silver bullet that fixes all of this. It won't. Rebuilding our intergenerational bonds will require not just investment, but whole new ways of working and thinking and fundamental reform. So these are the challenges we face, but we've got to face them. And I think now more than ever, we've got to act to rebuild bridges between the generations if we're going to have a chance of bringing this country back together again. And I want to just finish by tackling one issue, which is, well, what right have we, and we're a cross-party group of MPs and peers, what right do we have to, if you like, impose our view on how Britain should be on people? What happens if actually people of different generations are quite happy to live separate lives and quite happy to be increasingly segregated? And the same could be said in terms of different ethnic groups. This came up in our immigration reform. I think we have got a right to have a view on this and to seek to use the different levers at the disposal of government, central and local, to do something about this. Because the problem that we've got in our country right now, and why we are so divided, is because there is this vacuum that opens up when we aren't having those conversations, when we aren't understanding each other. I mean, it's really it is so sad to hear that statistic that grandchildren are quite happy to screw their grandparents and vice versa. What has become of our country? Now, if we don't do something about that, all this division that the Prime Minister was talking about and worries about is going to become far worse, and it can take our country into a very dark place. And that is why I think it's absolutely right that we take a view on this and look at all these divisions on the basis of age, immigration, race, the whole lot of them, and say, we are not going to continue to be a disunited kingdom. We've got to put the united back into the UK if we're actually going to be able to make it in the future and make this changed world work for more people. So that is at the core of our mission, and why I hope you'll work together with us to try and change the debate and make a properly united kingdom a reality. Anyway, I'll shut up now. Thanks so much for listening, everyone.